opponent will be Professor Anderson from Wake Forest, USA, and he was also part of the reading committee. Professor Anderson, please start your opposition.
Thank you. Thanks. Hi, Emilian. Good to see you again. I'd like to start by asking you a general question about herbivore effects on water cycling and water dynamics. In your thesis, you talk about the effects of livestock grazing. Can you walk me through all the effects of grazers on water cycling within a watershed? We know that grazers remove above ground biomass, they affect soils, they influence trampling and bulk density, and all these things have sort of a net effect on water. Can you please provide for me an explanation of how a watershed that has abundant grazers versus a watershed that has no grazers is influenced in terms of net hydrological water cycling?
Thank you, Mike Anderson, for the good question related to water dynamics in the Serengeti National Park. We did the experimental study on the effect of land use management, and in particular, we see focus on livestock grazing and wildlife grazing along selected small watersheds. What we observed, intensive livestock grazing has significant effects on the watershed quality that resulted in a short-lived flow levels, and this has contributed with the impact that is caused on the trampling of the soil and the grazing of the grass, which is important for water pathways. The only difference between the two grazers, I can say, might be the nature of the grazing patterns. Livestock are always taken care with somebody, so that repeated grazing on the same area resulted into reduced infiltration rates and reduced the grass biomass, as a result reducing water flow capacity. On the opposite, when you go inside the national parks, we are sure we have abundant grazers. To be specific, we are referring our wildlife. But because of their movement patterns and the grass utilization patterns, because they tend to move from place to place, they don't graze regularly on one place, then the ecosystem become more or less resilient. And that is why we observe a long-lived flow levels compared to any livestock grazing watersheds. I think I have answered your question.
So then I'd like to ask a follow-up question, Emilian. If I look at figure 3.2, so chapter 3, figure 2, I'm thinking of the map, the experimental design of your watershed analysis. So obviously this is a question of inside of the park and outside of the park, but your treatments, your watershed treatments are spatially clustered within each of those treatments. So all your livestock grazing watersheds occur very close to one another. All your fire treatments occur relatively close to one another, and your control treatments occur close to one another. And so my question is, how can you be sure that the effects that you saw were driven by livestock, fire, and native ungulates rather than some other underlying spatially confounding variable?
Thanks, Anderson. I don't totally ignore other variables to have an effect on the water, but based on our experiments, first of all, we decided to get them very close based on the assumption that they must be on the same soil properties. soil characteristics. That is why they are very close, so that the variation in terms of soil properties, soil texture can be avoided. But because we tested for livestock grazing, and then we tested for infiltration rates, we were sure that the impact we observed were mostly contributed by livestock grazing, because outside the park, it's within the Loliondo game controlled areas. It's a wildlife management area, but under different category where livestock grazing is allowed. So because there were somehow limited agriculture, limited other human activity except livestock grazing, so we are somehow sure that livestock grazing is a major contributor to the observed pattern on river flows.
Well, let me push you on that just a little bit and ask if you could go back and redo this experiment, and let's say money, time, and space were no constraint. We know that's never the case, but let's just assume, how would you redo this experiment, or maybe add to it, in order to really confidently conclude that it was livestock grazing or fire or native ungulates rather than a spatially confounding variable?
Thank you for the good questions. The other things which I will do, I will try to exclude other variables total, make sure that I only include livestock grazing within my experimental watershed, so that I can somehow exclude other confounding effects on the study. So if I have a chance and the money becomes available, I will make sure that I exclude everything outside the experimental watershed and then treat with the intensive livestock grazing. That might come with the results you are trying to predict.
Right. Another, I'll just mention this, another approach would be to include other regions that are sort of replicated around the park that also have livestock grazing and native grazing. That may be a way to really convince yourself that the livestock patterns and not some other confounding factor are indeed responsible. But more generally, the Serengeti is an ecosystem dominated by ecological gradients in herbivore density, gradients in forage quality, gradients in soil. Water is an important gradient, rainfall, and it's affected by all these other abiotic and biotic factors. Moving forward as a scientist, how is it that you're going to approach a system that has these many gradients and tease apart the abiotic and biotic effects in order to really understand what are the drivers and mechanisms of the response variable that you are interested in studying?
Thanks very much, Anderson. Thanks for your proposition, and I think that would be an interesting study to pursue. But the only thing would be important to include the other watersheds, as you are saying, because we have different watersheds within the Serengeti. We have the grassland watershed on the further south, where the Mbalageti and the Soronera River originates, and we have the wooded Moles watershed on the Loliondo game controlled area, where the Grumeti and the Banagi originates, and we have the forested one on the Mau catchment. So it will be good if we have another study which will look into all other watersheds and see the effect of grazers on the watershed qualities and subsequent on the flow dynamics. So I really look forward to carry another study so that we can have a broader picture of what is really happening on the watershed.
Do I have time for one last question?
I'm afraid not, Professor Anderson.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the opposition. The next questions will be asked by Professor Prins of Wageningen University, and he was also part of the reading committee. Professor Prins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Candidate, I read with enthusiasm your dissertation, and I think it is a lovely example of a mixture of pure science and nature conservation. What I would like to discuss with you is chapter 3, and your synthesis in as far as it is pertaining to Chapter 3. Now, before I start my question, perhaps as a fellow scientist, I can give you the ultimate compliment. Yesterday, I cited this paper, and I think that is a true compliment. The first I would like to address in your chapter number 3 on page 32 is that you are dealing there with the predictions of the IPCC. You do that on the page 32 in the middle, and the observation that the rainfall patterns do not seem to support the prediction that your region would become drier. And so that is what you're saying. Now, I took the ICCP report and I quote from its chapter 22, reduction in precipitation is likely over northern Africa and the southwestern part of South Africa by the end of the 21st century under the different scenarios. And they also say, well, perhaps this is going to happen in Ethiopia. But then they say explicitly, projected rainfall change over sub-Saharan Africa in the middle and late 21st century, so in the coming 80 years or so, is uncertain. So my question is, and of course, you know, Tanzania and the Serengeti does not fall in Southwest Africa, Ethiopia, or North Africa. So to be fair to the specialists of the ICCP, my question then is, why do you then refer to the publication of Bartske et al. And do not delve yourself really into the climate change predictions? Because you make a statement that the ICCP's predictions are not apparently underscored by your data.
Thanks, Professor Prince. First of all, thanks for your compliments regarding our work and your citation on our equatorology paper. Regarding the effect of climate change, and to be specific on the Serengeti ecosystem, with what you referred, what is happening in South Africa and then North America. It all depends with the scale of the study. If you consider at the broader scale, at the regional scale, that is where you can have such a pattern. But if you go at smaller scale, at the case for Serengeti National Park, we don't have evidence on the length. But if you go to the broader picture, we have evidence that like what we are saying on Ethiopia and South Africa. But given climate change is there, and our protected areas are also still there. So the possibility for reduce the landfill is there as well. And there's a possibility for some areas receiving more landfill is there as well. And we all know that landfill is a bigger influence on the biomass and on the water availability.
Yeah.
So
okay, it's clear. But you know, I think you are unfair to the ICCP because the ICCP is looking into the future and you're looking into the past. But the whole issue here is that the climate change discussion in your thesis functions here as what we call a red herring. Because the real issue, and that is why I admire this chapter so much, and that is why I'm so happy with this thesis, the real issue of your thesis has nothing to do with the predictions of the ICCP, but the fact, and that is what you are referring to, the fact that the farming in the watershed of the Mara River takes approximately 80% of the water at this moment, and in a dry year, it may take 100% of the water. That is the issue of today and the coming 5 years. And that is important because I think anything that has to do with policy debates must not refer to red herrings, but must refer, like you are a scientist, must refer to the facts of today. And this thing that is happening in the Masai Mara leads me then to your question, the second question. Are you aware of similar situations like is happening with the Mara River? Are you aware of similar issues happening in Tanzania or Kenya, where the natural water discharge is very badly, you know, compromised at this moment, or in the last 30 years or 40 years? Other situations in Tanzania or Kenya?
Yeah, with regard to flow level dynamics in Tanzania, and to be specific on national park, we have a number of evidence. We know what is happening on the Great Luo River with the catchment on the Usangu because of land use changes. We are now aware of what is going on the Wami River that drains the Shahada National Park, also because of obstruction of water and land use changes. And at the same time, we are also working on the Katavi National Park, where we have the Katuma River, which is a lifeline for the park. It's also facing some challenges, particularly the observed reduced flow is linked to land use change and of obstruction of water on the catchment. So to be specific or to summarize, Tanzania National Park as a broad, we are somehow challenged with water availability for wildlife, particularly in the dry season. So a number of parks are really challenged.
Yes. And so I can add to that, for example, Tsavo River, all the water has been taken by Taveta town and is not discharging into the national park anymore. I can refer to the Monduli River that already was taken in the 1950s and completely compromised the migration of the wildebeest in the Rift Valley. I can take the Ruvu River, etc. So the point is, and I think especially also not as a scientist, but also in your present day function, it becomes extremely important to really address the issues that are under our control. Climate change is not under your control, not under the control of Tanzanian government, but river management and catchment areas are under the control of managers like you. So that leads me to the third question. Now, on page 34, you make a fascinating statement at the end of the first paragraph, and I quote it for you, you don't have to look it up. If these flow dynamics are not quantified, you write, and if they're not monitored, their consequences for people and wildlife can not be predicted and mitigated. It is the mitigation that I am intrigued by, because on page 47, you basically make the prediction that the flow of the Mara will cease and it will likely destroy the annual migration of zebra and wildebeest. Now, I was shocked. I did not realize it was so bad. Yeah? But then, I was hoping for the mitigation because that is what you're promising. Yeah? Because you say, we have to monitor, we have to measure, and then we can mitigate. Now, it's not in that chapter, so I found that disappointing. So then I turned to the synthesis. Page 96, above the middle, you raise the flag again, but now you do something different. You say, failure to address water management issue at basin scale will perhaps in this disaster. So failure to address the issue. But you did not investigate that. You don't discuss that. So who is failing? Could you please explain that to us? Is that the Maasai? Is that Tanzania National Parks? Is that the Kenyan government? Who is to be blamed now?
Thank you very much for good observations and a comment. What we observed in this study, we have shown that land use outside national park has a significant impact on the flow level within a protected area. And to be specific, we have shown that the livestock grazing within the Loliondo game control has reduced the retention time for water for the Gulumet River. At the same time, we have shown that land use changes within the Mara catchments, in addition with the abstraction of water to meet irrigation demand, has affected the flow regime of the Mara River. For instance, during 1972, the recession time scale of the Mara River was 100 days. So the catchment would require rainfall at least 3 once after 3 months. But that has reduced to 16 days on a recent. So what we are saying, given the setup of the management of protected areas in Tanzania, we as national parks are confined within boundaries, and most of the boundaries of the protected areas are defined based on a key wildlife species. But when you take into consideration water is an important component for the ecosystem, then maybe the boundary of protected area goes beyond what we think it's the boundary. So what we are saying, much of the degradation occurs on community, on village lands. So that requires a sort of integrated effort, concerted effort, so that we can act together and achieve management objectives. So it's a challenge to TANAPA to start thinking outside of the box, how they can include the communities on catchment management and how can they incentivize the community so that they can participate on ensuring the sustainable management of the watershed, and by so doing, ensuring the water availability for our wildlife.
Okay, thank you very much. My time is nearly up, and so I have to give the word back, but I would plead that you start looking at examples in Africa, and especially from Zimbabwe and Zambia, where international cooperation between countries on watershed management is taking place. So it is not only local people, it is also your government and the Kenyan government that have to sit together to prevent this disaster that is going to happen in Serengeti. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Professor Prins. We'll move on to the next opponent, Professor Smith from this university, who was also part of the reading committee. Professor Smith, please.
Yeah, thank you. So, dear candidate, congratulations also from my side with this very nice thesis. I enjoyed reading it a lot. It's well written, combines different approaches, conceptual work, literature review, field experiments, descriptive study. And it's also very relevant to conservation, as has already been said. Well, I have, of course, a few questions. So one of your key themes that you discuss, it's also in the title, it's in your proposition 7 in chapters 2 and 4 and 5, it has to do with water requirements, right? And it's quite central now for spatial niche partitioning of grazing herbivores. In addition to the more classical approaches that have food availability, body size, etc. Now, your work is very much focused, obviously, on the African savannas. And as an ecologist, and I think as most of us are here, I think it's relevant to compare systems and also compare findings and concepts to other systems. So, well, I happen to work more in European systems for that matter, also with natural herbivores. So I was wondering, to what degree do you think you can apply this concept also to other herbivore communities in, let's say, Europe or America or Australia? So with the focus on water requirements.
First of all, I would like to accept the compliment regarding the good work you have led. And the second, I will respond on your question. What we observed on herbivores' water requirements, it's correct that it has been conducted on the savannas, and we know systems do differ in terms of vegetation, in terms of water, in terms of rainfall, they differ a lot. So not only it is important going further on the temperate region, but we can also take the same approach and do a study on other systems in Tanzania. For instance, we have the Nyerere National Park that used to be Seruga Reserve. It's totally on the Miombo woodlands, and we believe soil characteristics could be different from the Serengeti. At the same time, we can go and do the same study to Lua and see how the system responds on as far as the water requirements is concerned. So I really agree with you. It's a good step to go to apply these concepts on other systems where they are not savanna. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this answer. So indeed, I was wondering, in other systems, you may have obviously other constraints, and water constraints or a thermal regulation may be of less importance, or depending on that. So what if in a particular system this thermal regulation is much less important? How important is it then to consider in explaining herbivore communities or assemblages?
Can you come back? I didn't get you clear. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so in the case that the thermal regulation or water requirements are not limiting in a particular community or an ecosystem, would it still be valuable then to include, to explain the herbivore community or the assembly?
Yeah, you are right. In case water requirement is not a limiting factor, we know the distribution of herbivore across the landscapes are governed by different factors. One is food availability, the other one could be water availability, and the grant has done some research and showed that predation also has an influence on the landscape used by herbivore. So in the other system, when water becomes unlimited, the herbivore could be limited by other constraints, such as the predation risk, such as food availability, based on the amount of land food that particular area is receiving. So there are other confounding factors which are really important to take into consideration when